Welcome to Landlord's Self-Help Center's Landlord Education Series. I would like to introduce myself and my colleagues, Silvana Agostino, Alda Pereira, Carolina Rego, and myself, Diana Padierna. We are community legal workers at the Landlord's Self-Help Center, and will be providing today's presentation, which will address the topic of annual rent increases. This presentation offers general information only, not legal advice. Please be aware that we will be recording this presentation, so click on Accept in the pop-up. There will also be a question period at the end of the presentation. We will be answering the questions previously received, so thank you very much for sending them to our email address. Unfortunately, the chat will not be monitored, and please keep yourselves muted during this presentation. In Ontario, the Residential Tenancies Act 2006 is a provincial law that governs most residential rental agreements. It defines the rights and responsibilities of both landlords and tenants and outlines the rules and procedures for giving a notice of rent increase. More specifically, Section 120 of the Residential Tenancies Act deals with the guideline increase information pertaining to this presentation. According to the Residential Tenancies Act, rent is an amount of money given to a landlord or a landlord's agent in exchange for the right to occupy the rental unit. And it also defines a tenant as a person who pays rent for the right to occupy a rental unit. There are important things to consider when serving a rent increase notice to your tenant. This notice can only be served to the tenant once every 12 months. You can only increase the rent by the approved guideline amount unless you obtained special permission from the Landlord and Tenant Board to increase the rent by a higher amount. Do not round up. Use the exact amount calculated or round down. Rounding up would mean an illegal rent increase. Make sure to serve the notice properly, so you do not have to start over. If you have to start over, you have to provide a new notice period, which will delay the effective date of your rent increase. It is important to note that if you don't provide your tenant with a rent increase every 12 months, you lose the rent increase. You are not allowed to backtrack and collect on missed rent increases. Also note that permission is not needed from the Landlord and Tenant Board when doing a rent increase by the guideline amount. But make sure to follow the rules and use the proper Landlord and Tenant Board notice. I will now pass it on to my colleague, Silvana.
The annual rent increase guideline is the maximum a landlord can increase without obtaining approval from the Landlord and Tenant Board. The rent can be increased by the guideline amount every 12 months after the last rent increase or 12 months from when the tenant moved in. When increasing the rent, you must provide the tenant with a 90 days notice, Form N1. The annual rent increase guideline is announced by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing by the 31st of August of the previous year, and the calculation is based on the Ontario Consumer Price Index. Please visit our website for more information on the guideline increases. The annual increase guideline is determined according to Section 120, subsection 2 of the RTA, which averages the monthly Ontario Consumer Price Index over a 12-month period. The data used to determine the guideline is taken from June to May of the previous year. In 2012, the RTA was amended to cap the annual guideline increase to 2.5% each year, which means that if the calculation for the annual guideline amount exceeds 2.5% in any given year, it will be reduced to 2.5%. If you require an increase above 2.5 is required, a landlord must follow the process to seek approval for an above guideline increase. How to calculate the amount of the guideline. For example, if your tenant moved in January 1st, 2021, the earliest date you can increase the rent would be January 1st, 2022. The N1 notice should be given to the tenant by September 2021, by the end of September, to be effective on January 1st, 2022. When calculating the increase amount, simply take their monthly rent and multiply it by the appropriate guideline percentage for that year. For 2022, the guideline increase is 1.2%. For example, if your monthly rent is $1,200 a month, the allowable increase for 2022 is $14.40. When serving the N1 form, the new rent amount can be stated as $1,214.40 or $1,214. Do not round the amount up, as this is incorrect and would make it an illegal rent increase. This is the N1 notice that must be given to the tenant if the landlord wishes to increase the rent by the guideline amount. The form is available at the Landlord and Tenant Board website. The notice must provide at least 90 days notice before it takes effect, and the date must take effect on the day that the rent is due. If the proper form is not provided, the tenant can refuse to pay the rent increase. Make sure your notice is correctly completed before giving it to the tenant. For more information on how to complete the N1 notice, please refer to our learning modules on our website. Bill 184 amended the RTA by including section 135.1, which deals with increases in rent that would otherwise be void as a result of the landlord's failure to give a proper 90 days written notice. Under section 135.1, subsection 1 and 2, the increase is deemed not to be void if the tenant has paid the increased rent in respect of each rental period for at least 12 consecutive months, and provided that the tenant has not, within 1 year after the date the increase is first charged, made an application in which the validity of the lawful rent increase is an issue. Thank you, and I will pass it on to Carolina.
Thank you, Silvana. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Government of Ontario passed Bill 204, Helping Tenants and Small Businesses Act, on October 1st, 2020. This act freezes rent increases from January 1st to December 31st of 2021. Notices given to take effect during this period will be deemed void. Schedule 7 of Bill 204, the Helping Tenants and Small Businesses Act 2020, allows for a few exceptions to the rent freeze. One exemption to the rent increase freeze is for sections 121 and 123 of the Residential Tenancies Act, where there's an agreement to increase rent based on capital expenditures, additional facilities, privileges, or services that are being added to the rental unit. Before serving your tenant with a notice of rent increase for these exemptions, check with a legal service provider to make sure it is being done lawfully. The good news is that rent increases will be allowed for 2022. The annual rent increase guideline amount is capped at 1.2% for next year. Landlords must give their tenants 90 days written notice before the rent increase takes effect, and they must use the prescribed Form N1. There are a few exemptions to the annual rent increase guideline. Bill 57, the Restoring Trust, Transparency, and Accountability Act 2018, amended the Residential Tenancies Act to allow for the elimination of the annual rent guideline amount for certain rental units. More specifically, for units that were not occupied for residential purposes before November 15, 2018, meaning they were empty or used as commercial space, and newly built units in detached, semi-detached, and row houses that meet specific requirements. The specific requirements for newly built units in a detached, semi-detached, or row house are as follows. The property cannot contain more than 2 rental units. The unit must have its own kitchen, washroom, and 1 or more exterior entrance. The unit door must be able to be locked from the inside, and there must be a door that can be locked from the outside. The residential unit came into existence on or after November 15, 2018, and 1 or both of the following apply. The building is owner occupied, and the unit was created in a previously unfinished space. All of these conditions must be met in order for the exemption to exist. The N2 notice on the right is used for rental units that are exempted from the annual guideline increase amount. This means that the landlord can set their own amount for the unit. However, a proper 90-day notice must still be provided to the tenant using this landlord and tenant board form. Section 6.1 of the Residential Tenancies Act 2006 explains the exemptions related to rent. The N2 notice would be used in these situations. Make sure to read the notice before giving it to the tenant, as it contains important information for both parties to be aware of. Thank you. Now I will pass it on to Alda, who will talk about how to serve the notice.
Thank you, Carolina. I'm going to be talking about service rules. There are several different methods of serving a notice of rent increase. Make sure to deliver the notice to the tenant according to the Landlord and Tenant Board rules, which are the following. Handing the notice to the tenant, handing it to an apparently adult person in the rental unit, placing it in the tenant's mailbox or where mail is ordinarily delivered, sliding it under the door of the rental unit, faxing it to the tenant's residence or place of business, or sending the notice by courier or mail with additional time added for delivery. If sent by courier, you would have to add 1 day. If sending it by mail, you would add 5 days. Improper service of this notice will result in you having to start the process all over again. You should never post this notice on the door of the rental unit or send it by text message, as this would not be considered proper service and will make the notice invalid. As of December 15, 2018, the Landlord and Tenant Board introduced a consent to service by email form that landlords and tenants can use to agree to service of the notice of rent increase by email. It's not a requirement to use this form, but it is suggested that you document the agreement with your tenant using this form in order to obtain all of the required information. It is important to note that the consent to service by email can be revoked at any time by the landlord or the tenant, as long as it is done in writing. Upon receiving a notice of rent increase, the tenant has a few options. They can pay the increase, refuse to pay the increase, or decide to move out. If the tenant refuses to pay the increased rent, the landlord may have to serve the N4 notice for non-payment of rent and go through the process of applying to the Landlord and Tenant Board. If the tenant decides to move out of the rental unit instead of paying the new rent, they should provide the notice, the Form N9, Tenant's Notice to End the Tenancy, with at least 60 days notice before the end of the lease or the rental period. If the landlord and the tenant agree to an earlier termination, Form N11, the agreement to end the tenancy, can be signed between the parties instead. The period of time on the N11 can be whatever both parties agree on. Thank you.
It's very important to educate yourself and gather information about various topics related to renting. Use resources found on the Landlord and Tenant Board and Landlord Self-Help Center's websites to help guide you. The Landlord and Tenant Board website has links to instructions for many of their notices and applications, as well as interpretation guidelines, which provide more information about the decision process. Thank you so much for your attention. We will now address your questions. The first question that we received says the following. Can I give the tenant my own notice of rent increase, or do I have to use the form? Silvana, would you please answer this question?
Sure. No, you cannot give your own notice of rent increase. According to section 116, subsection 3 of the RTA, the landlord must give the rent increase notice in the form approved by the Landlord and Tenant Board, which means that either a form N1 or an N2 notice must be given to your tenant.
Okay, the following question says, where can I get the latest version of the N1 notice? Elda, would you like to answer that, please?
Okay, sure. You have to make sure to get the current rent increase form, and it's you can find it on the Landlord and Tenant Board's website.
Okay, the following question says, I missed my increase for 2020. Can I add that to the increase I am giving my tenant for 2022? Carolina, can you answer that, please?
Sure. No, unfortunately, you can't add any past rent increases as they're forfeited if you don't take them as you're legally allowed to every year. So if you don't take it as the law allows, you lose it. Next question says, I didn't serve a proper N1 notice. I only gave my tenant a verbal notice and my tenant has been paying it for over a year. Is this okay? Diana, would you like to answer this?
Sure, that's a very good question. According to section 135.1 of the RTA, if the tenant has paid the new rent amount for at least 12 consecutive months, and provided that the tenant has not filed an application with the Landlord and Tenant Board within 1 year from when the rent amount increased, it is now deemed to be a legal rent increase. Okay, so the following question says, I gave my tenant a rent increase notice on November 1st, 2020. Doesn't that mean they are supposed to pay the increased amount starting February 1st, 2021? Silvana, would you like to answer that, please?
Sure. No, due to the rent freeze in 2021, you cannot increase the rent. The date that the increase is to take effect is what matters, not the day that you served the notice, because the notice said that the rent increase started February 1st, 2021. It is an invalid notice and the tenant does not have to pay the increase.
Okay, the next question says, can I serve notice in 2021 even though there is a rent freeze and the increase takes effect in 2022? Alda, would you like to answer that, please?
Sure. Yes, if you give the notice in 2021, as long as it takes effect in 2022, then that is okay.
Okay, the next question says, so if the tenant and I agree to increase the rent by 20% because I am going to redo the roof, is that okay? Carolina, would you like to answer that?
Sure. No, this is not okay. The agreed increase cannot exceed the guideline plus 3%. So for 2022, The agreed increase cannot be more than 4.2%. Next question says, I gave my tenant a rent increase to start January 1st, 2022, but now the tenant wants to add a parking space for an extra $50 a month. Is this allowed? Diana, would you like to answer this?
Sure. So yeah, that's a yes. This agreed increase will fall under section 123 of the RTA. And as long as both the landlord and the tenant agree in writing to this increase, it's okay to increase the rent by $50 for the parking spot. Okay, so the next question says, my tenant moved into the rental unit in September of 2021. Can I give them a rent increase for 2022? Silvana, would you like to answer that, please?
Sure. Yes, you can give your tenant a rent increase in 2022. However, the rent increase cannot start until September 1st, 2022, as you have to wait 12 months before you can increase the rent on a new tenant.
Okay. The next question says, I bought a newly built condo unit and it closed in December of 2020. My tenant moved into the unit on January 1st, 2021. Does this mean I can increase the rent by whatever I want on January 1st, 2022? Alda, would you like to answer that, please?
Okay. Yes, since it's a newly built unit, the rent increase can be the rent could be increased by any amount, as long as you still provide the proper notice, 90 days notice, and the proper form. In this case, in the N2 notice would be the appropriate notice of rent increase.
Okay, thank you. The last question says, I own my home and decided to fix and finish my basement to turn it into a separate unit that I can rent. Is this unit exempt from the rent increase amount? Carolina, would you please answer that?
Yes. Yes, this unit is exempt as long as it has its own kitchen, washroom, and one or more exterior entrance, and a door that can be locked from both inside and outside. The unit must also have been created on or after November 15, 2018.
Okay, that's it for the question period. On behalf of the Landlord Self-Help Center, thank you so much for attending this presentation about rent increases. We look forward to see you in the upcoming presentations.